The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at his office window, watching the city slowly wake up. Market vendors were already setting up their stalls, children walked to school with books balanced on their heads, and the familiar sounds of everyday life drifted through the bulletproof glass. At 42, Traoré had led Burkina Faso through 3 years of remarkable stability, a feat many thought impossible in the volatile Sahel region. Behind him, the quiet footsteps announced the arrival of his most trusted guardian. Chief of Security Usman Sankara entered without fanfare, as was his way. For 36 months, Usman had been more than a protector. He had been a shadow of unwavering vigilance, a man whose loyalty seemed carved from the very bedrock of the nation. "Good morning, Mr. President," Usman said, his voice carrying the familiar tone of respectful authority that had become a comfort to Traoré over the years. "Morning, Usman. How did the perimeter checks go?" "Clean, sir. All posts reported normal activity. The new rotation schedule is working well." Usman paused, consulting his tablet. "Your cabinet meeting is scheduled for 9. Ministers Compaoré, Zongo, and Cabaret arrived early and are having breakfast in the dining hall." Traoré turned from the window, studying his security chief's face. There was something different today. A tightness around the eyes, a slight tension in the jaw. But Usman had always been serious about his work, perhaps even more so lately. "Everything all right, my friend?" Usman nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Just ensuring every detail is perfect." What Traoré didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, Usman had received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end spoke perfect French with a slight accent, European, possibly Belgian or Swiss. The caller knew details about Usman's life that should have been impossible to obtain. His daughter Ayla's university schedule in Morocco, her favorite cafe near campus, even the route she took to her part-time job at a local bookstore. "Your daughter is brilliant," the voice had said. "Political science major, dreams of working for the African Union. It would be tragic if something happened to interrupt her studies." The photographs arrived by encrypted message the next day. Ayla walking to class, Ayla studying in the library, Ayla laughing with friends at a cafe. Each image was time-stamped, showing surveillance spanning weeks. The final image showed her alone in her dormitory room, reading by lamplight, completely unaware she was being watched. The instructions were simple. Create an opening during the Monday cabinet meeting. Disable security protocols. Allow access for a specialized team. The president would be removed quietly, efficiently. In exchange, Ayla would continue her studies unharmed. "You have 72 hours to decide," the voice had concluded. "Choose wisely, Chief Sankara. Your daughter's future depends on it." For 3 sleepless nights, Usman had wrestled with an impossible choice. He thought of every moment he had spent protecting Traoré, the car bomb he had personally defused, the assassination attempt he had thwarted in Niger, the countless threats he had neutralized before they could even reach the president's attention. But he also thought of Ayla's laugh, her dreams of helping to build a stronger Africa, the promise he had made to his late wife to keep his daughter safe. In the end, love won over loyalty. Or perhaps it was fear. Usman could no longer tell the difference. The presidential dining hall buzzed with the warm conversation of old colleagues. Defense Minister Traoré, a bear of a man with graying temples and laugh lines earned through decades of service, was regaling the table with another of his famous stories. "So I was there," he said, gesturing dramatically with his coffee cup, "standing in the middle of this village surrounded by 50 escaped goats, and the regional administrator is telling me this is a minor logistical oversight." Agriculture Minister Traoré nearly choked on his breakfast. "You're exaggerating again, Traoré." "Not a word of it. Ask Minister Zongo, he was there." Finance Minister Zongo, a meticulous man who approached everything with scholarly precision, adjusted his glasses and smiled. The number was closer to 30 goats, but they did interrupt the entire infrastructure inspection. The laughter that followed was genuine, the kind that only comes from shared hardships and mutual respect. These men had worked together through economic crises, security threats, and the daily grind of governing a nation still finding its footing in a turbulent region. President Traoré entered the dining hall, and the conversation shifted naturally as his ministers stood to greet him. But the warmth remained. This was more than a political cabinet. These were brothers in the truest sense, bound by their shared vision for Burkina Faso's future. "Gentlemen, please sit," Traoré said, taking his place at the head of the table. "I trust everyone slept well?" "Better than you, I suspect," Zongo observed. "The lights in your office were on past midnight again." Traoré shrugged. "The Regional Economic Summit proposals won't review themselves." As they ate, the conversation drifted to family matters. Traoré's son had been accepted to medical school in Ghana. Traoré's daughter was getting married next month, and Zongo's grandson had taken his first steps. These personal moments, Traoré had learned, were what made governance possible. Trust, built in quiet morning conversations, translated into effective leadership when crises emerged. At exactly 8:45, Usman appeared in the doorway. His timing was perfect, as always. "Mr. President, the cabinet room is ready for your meeting." As the ministers gathered their papers and finished their coffee, none of them noticed the slight tremor in Usman's voice or the way his eyes avoided direct contact. They were accustomed to his professional demeanor, his economy of words, his focus on security details rather than casual conversation. Walking down the marble corridor toward the cabinet room, Traoré fell into step beside his security chief. "Usman, I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding the regional security cooperation proposal." "Sir?" "The idea of sharing intelligence protocols with Mali and Niger. I think you're right. We should move forward with it." Usman's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Yes, sir, that would be wise." "After today's meeting, I'd like you to draft a preliminary framework. Your insights on cross-border threats have always been valuable." The irony was crushing. Even now, as Usman prepared to betray everything he had sworn to protect, Traoré was asking for his help in building the very systems that might have prevented this betrayal. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force. "Of course, Mr. President, I'll have something prepared by tomorrow." As they reached the cabinet room doors, Traoré placed a hand on Usman's shoulder, a gesture of friendship and trust that felt like a knife to the security chief's heart. "Thank you, my friend, for everything you do." Usman managed a nod, then stepped aside to let the president enter first. In that moment, he made his final check. The emergency lighting system he had sabotaged the night before, the electronic locks he had reprogrammed, the communication jamming device hidden in the ventilation system. Everything was in place. At exactly 8:58 a.m., his encrypted radio buzzed once, the confirmation he had been dreading. "Guardian Angel in position. Commence on signal." The presidential cabinet room reflected the dignity and history of Burkina Faso. Rich mahogany paneling lined the walls, interspersed with portraits of independence heroes and maps of the nation's provinces. The large oval table could seat 20, though today only 8 ministers were present for the weekly security and economic briefing. Traoré took his customary seat at the head of the table, facing east toward the morning light filtering through bulletproof windows. To his right sat Defense Minister Gunfire and Agriculture Minister Traoré. To his left, Finance Minister Zongo and Interior Minister Sawadogo. The remaining seats were occupied by the Ministers of Education, Health, and Foreign Affairs. Usman positioned himself near the eastern entrance, as he had done hundreds of times before. From this vantage point, he could monitor both the main corridor and the secure side exit, while maintaining visual contact with every person in the room. It was textbook security positioning, refined through years of experience and training. "Before we begin," Traoré announced, "I want to acknowledge the excellent work everyone did on the drought relief coordination last month. The international response has been overwhelming, and it's largely due to the detailed proposals this team prepared." The ministers exchanged satisfied glances. The drought that had threatened to devastate 3 northern provinces had been managed through careful resource allocation and international partnerships. It was exactly the kind of collaborative success that made their work meaningful. Finance Minister Zongo opened his leather portfolio and began arranging his presentation materials. "Mr. President, if I may begin with the economic briefing, we have several time-sensitive matters to address." "Please, proceed." As Zongo launched into his analysis of agricultural subsidies and infrastructure investments, the familiar rhythm of governance took hold. Ministers took notes, asked clarifying questions, and engaged in the kind of substantive policy discussion that actually moved the country forward. None of them noticed that Usman had shifted his position slightly, moving closer to the main electrical panel hidden behind a decorative screen. None of them saw him press his earpiece once, a signal so subtle it looked like adjusting a minor irritation. At exactly 9:23 a.m., as Finance Minister Zongo was explaining the projected impact of road improvements on rural market access, the lights cut out. The room plunged into darkness for exactly 3 seconds before the emergency backup system engaged, bathing everything in the eerie red glow of crisis lighting. The electronic locks clicked shut with mechanical precision. The air conditioning system died, leaving only the soft hum of emergency power and the suddenly amplified sound of 8 men breathing. "Power failure," Usman announced, his voice steady and professional. "Standard lockdown protocol is now in effect." But Defense Minister Traoré, whose military training had taught him to notice details others missed, was already studying Usman's posture. The security chief's stance was different, not the relaxed alertness of someone responding to an unexpected crisis, but the rigid tension of someone executing a plan. Minister Zongo, still holding his economic projections, looked up sharply. "Standard lockdown? But your radio equipment is still functioning." "Backup power system, Minister. Presidential protection protocol takes priority." "Then why," Zongo pressed, his analytical mind engaging, "did the interior doors seal electronically before any external threat was confirmed?" The question hung in the red-tinted air like an accusation. Usman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Security systems are automated, sir. My duty is to protect the president, not to explain every technical detail." But the spell was broken. The ministers were no longer following procedure. They were questioning it. And in that shift from compliance to suspicion, Usman's carefully crafted plan began to unravel. President Traoré, who had remained calm throughout the exchange, now stood slowly. His instincts, honed through years of political survival, were screaming warnings. "Usman," he said quietly, "open the main door." "Sir, the protocol requires—" "Open the door." The command was soft but absolute. Usman reached for his radio, speaking into it with practiced authority. "Control, this is Chief Sankara. Unlock main entrance immediately." Still nothing. He tried again, louder this time. "Control, this is Chief Sankara. Unlock main entrance immediately." Still nothing. Minister Compare stood up, his bulk filling the space between his chair and the table. "Usman, who exactly are you talking to on that radio?" For the first time in 3 years, Usman Sankara's composure cracked. The question hit him like a physical blow, because he realized he didn't know the answer. The voices on the radio had never given names, never provided credentials, never offered anything but threats and instructions. "I'm in contact with External Security Coordination," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "What external security?" Zongo demanded, his financial analyst's mind cutting through deception like a blade. "We have no external security protocols. All emergency coordination runs through Captain Dio's unit." Traoré took a step back from Usman, not in fear, but in preparation. "Show me your communication log." The request was simple, reasonable, and impossible to fulfill. Usman's encrypted radio contained only coded signals and voice commands from handlers he had never met. There was no official log, no paper trail, no legitimate authorization for anything he had done. In the silence that followed, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. But they weren't the measured steps of palace guards. They were the quick, tactical movements of professionals preparing for assault. "Get down," Compare shouted, his military instincts overriding everything else. The door exploded inward. The assault was swift and professional. 4 men in tactical gear burst through the shattered doorway, weapons raised, moving with the precision of special forces operators. Their faces were covered, their equipment military-grade, their coordination flawless. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had expected to find a room full of politicians cowering in fear. Instead, they encountered men who lived through coups, survived civil wars, and fought for their nation's independence in more ways than one. Minister Compare, despite being in his 60s, moved with the speed and instinct of the paratrooper he had once been. He overturned the heavy conference table with a crash that sent papers flying and created instant cover. "Kabore! Zongo! Behind the table! Now!" President Traoré, rather than freezing or running, dropped into a combat crouch he had learned during his own military service decades earlier. His eyes swept the room, calculating angles, distances, and opportunities. "Usman!" he shouted. "Defensive positions!" But Usman didn't move to protect. Instead, he stepped aside, clearing the attacker's line of sight to the president. In that moment, 3 years of trust shattered like glass. The first attacker raised his rifle toward Traoré, but Minister Zongo, the mild-mannered economist who collected rare books and wrote poetry in his spare time, hurled his heavy briefcase with surprising accuracy. It struck the gunman's weapon, sending his shot wide. The bullet, meant for the president's chest, instead shattered a portrait of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had given Burkina Faso its name and ideals. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. "Traitor!" Compare roared, but he wasn't looking at the attackers. His eyes were fixed on Usman, who stood frozen in the doorway like a man caught between 2 worlds. The second attacker moved toward the overturned table where the ministers had taken cover, but Agriculture Minister Traoré, a man who had spent his youth farming and knew the weight of every tool in his hands, grabbed a ceremonial spear from the wall display and hurled it with the precision of someone who had once hunted guinea fowl in the savannah. The spear caught the attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the marble floor. Traoré didn't hesitate. He dove forward, seized the fallen rifle, and took position behind a marble pillar. The room had become a battlefield, but it was not the quick execution the attackers had planned. These ministers were fighting back with a ferocity born of genuine love for their country and absolute refusal to surrender. President Traoré, using the chaos to his advantage, rolled behind the presidential desk and emerged with a pistol, a weapon he had hoped never to use but had kept within reach since taking office. His hands were steady as he took aim at the third attacker. "This is Burkina Faso," he declared, his voice cutting through the gunfire and confusion. The shot was clean and precise. The attacker dropped. But even as the immediate threat diminished, the larger betrayal was becoming clear. Usman wasn't fighting alongside them. He wasn't coordinating defense. He was standing in the doorway, speaking rapidly into his radio in a language none of them recognized, calling for backup that wouldn't come from their own forces. Minister Zongo, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow where flying debris had caught him, pointed an accusing finger at the security chief. "You planned this." Usman's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," he shouted. "They have my daughter. They'll kill her if I don't—" "If you don't kill us," Traoré finished, his voice deadly quiet despite the chaos around them. The fourth attacker, seeing his mission collapsing, made a desperate lunge toward the president, but Minister Comparé, moving with surprising agility for his size, intercepted him. The two men crashed into the wall, struggling for control of the rifle. "Help him," Traoré shouted to Zongo, but the finance minister was already moving, grabbing a heavy crystal paperweight from the destroyed desk and bringing it down on the attacker's head. The man crumpled. The immediate assault was over, but the betrayal was just beginning to unfold. The silence that followed the gunfire was broken by the distant sound of helicopters. Through the shattered windows came the mechanical thunder of rotor blades and the organized shouts of approaching forces. Usman's radio crackled to life. "Abort mission. Backup arrived too early. Repeat, abort and extract." The irony was devastating. The very security protocols Usman had helped design over 3 years, the rapid response systems, the communication networks, the coordination with elite units, had worked perfectly. Captain Dio and his presidential guard had detected the breach within minutes and mobilized overwhelming force. The conference room door, already damaged by the explosion, was suddenly filled with palace guards in full tactical gear. Captain Dio led them, his rifle raised, his voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. "Room secured. Medical teams advance." Behind him came a flood of elite soldiers, their movements coordinated and professional. These were men trained not just in combat, but in protection, not just in violence, but in service. They had spent 3 years learning to guard not just a president, but the very idea of democratic governance in West Africa. Usman watched the mentor with growing desperation. His handlers had promised him that the palace guard would be neutralized, that communication systems would be jammed, that backup would be delayed long enough for the mission to succeed. None of it had happened. As medics rushed to tend to Minister Zongo's head wound and check the other ministers for injuries, Captain Dio approached President Traoré with the kind of respectful urgency that marked true professionalism. "Mr. President, are you injured?" "I'm fine, Captain, but we have a larger problem." Traoré's eyes moved to Usman, who stood motionless near the destroyed doorway. "Our security has been compromised." Dio followed the president's gaze, and understanding dawned immediately. He had wondered why the attackers had known exactly when to strike, how they had accessed the building's electrical systems, why the timing had been so precise. Now he knew. "Sir," one of Dio's sergeants called from beside one of the fallen attackers, "this man is still alive." "Secure him for interrogation," Dio ordered. Then, turning back to Usman, he spoke with the weight of absolute authority. "Chief Sankara, you will surrender your weapon and communication device immediately." "Let me walk out of here," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Or he dies." The room tensed. Dio's men raised their weapons but held fire. The angle was too dangerous, the risk to Traoré too high. President Traoré, despite everything, felt a moment of profound sadness. "You taught me hostage protocol, Usman," he said quietly. "You said never negotiate with desperation, never follow a hostage-taker into darkness. That was before they took my daughter. And what happens to her if you murder innocent men today?" The question hit Usman like a physical blow. He had been so focused on the immediate threat to Aila that he hadn't considered the long-term consequences. If he killed Traoré, if he escaped the palace, if he somehow survived this betrayal, what kind of life would that leave for his daughter? What kind of father would she remember? In that moment of doubt, his grip loosened slightly. It was all Captain Dio needed. The shot was precise, merciful, and final. Usman Sankara crumpled to the floor, his 3 years of loyal service ending in betrayal and tragedy. The basement interrogation room in the presidential palace had never been designed for comfort. Bare concrete walls, a single table, 2 chairs, and lighting that cast harsh shadows. It was a place where truth was extracted through patience and pressure rather than violence. The surviving attacker sat with his hands restrained, his tactical gear removed, his face pale but defiant. Across from him sat Colonel Bassione from Burkina Faso's intelligence service, flanked by Captain Dio and a stenographer recording every word. For the first hour, the man said nothing. He stared at the wall behind his interrogators, his jaw set, his breathing controlled. He had clearly been trained for this scenario. But Colonel Bassione was patient. He had broken more stubborn men than this. He began with simple questions: name, nationality, training background. When those received no response, he shifted tactics. "We know about Guardian Angel," he said simply. For the first time, the attacker's eyes focused on his interrogator. "We know about the girl in Morocco. We know about the other families." The man's composure cracked slightly, a twitch at the corner of his eye, a slight tightening of his jaw. "We've found your communication equipment, encrypted drives, satellite phones, financial transfer records. Did you really think we wouldn't be able to trace the money?" Colonel Bassione leaned back in his chair, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "The thing about operations like this is that they leave traces. Bank transfers, vehicle rentals, hotel registrations. Your handlers might be professional, but they're not invisible." The attacker finally spoke, his accent confirming what they had suspected. He was not African. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This is bigger than your little country, bigger than your president. Then help us understand." What followed was a confession that chilled everyone in the room. Guardian Angel wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was a systematic campaign targeting every stable democracy in West and Central Africa. The goal wasn't immediate regime change, but long-term destabilization, turning protectors into assassins, creating chaos that would justify international intervention. 17 targets, the man said, his defiance giving way to something that might have been relief at finally telling the truth. Security chiefs, presidential guards, intelligence officers, all of them with families abroad, all of them with pressure points. "Who's running the operation?" "I don't know names. We operate in cells. But the funding comes from defense contractors, intelligence services, multinational corporations with mining interests. They want instability because stable governments negotiate better deals." Colonel Bassione exchanged glances with Captain Dio. This was worse than a simple assassination attempt. This was economic warfare disguised as political chaos. "What about the families? How many are being held?" "I don't know the exact number, but your security chief's daughter was just one of many. They have children in Morocco, students in France, workers in Belgium, wherever Africans send their children for education or opportunity. The cruel efficiency of it was breathtaking. Use Africa's greatest strength, its commitment to education and advancement, as a weapon against its leaders. How do we stop it? The attacker almost smiled. You can't. For every security chief you protect, there are 10 more vulnerabilities. For every family you secure, there are dozens of others at risk. This is just the beginning. But he was wrong about one thing. He had underestimated what happens when Africans decide to work together. Within 6 hours of the attack, encrypted communications were flowing between presidential palaces across West Africa. President Traoré's first call went to Assimi Goïta in Mali, his second to the Leadership Council in Niger. By evening, emergency intelligence briefings were being conducted in Accra, Abidjan, Dakar, and N'Djamena. The revelation of Guardian Angel had transformed a national crisis into a continental emergency. Intelligence services that had long operated in isolation suddenly found themselves sharing critical information, identifying patterns they had missed when working alone. In Morocco, security forces moved swiftly to locate and secure Aila Sankara and 12 other students who had been under surveillance. The operation was conducted with extraordinary care. These young people were victims, not criminals. They were provided with psychological support, secure housing, and protection while investigations continued. In Côte d'Ivoire, authorities raided a villa in Abidjan that had been serving as a coordination center for Guardian Angel operations. What they found was sophisticated communication equipment worth millions, detailed psychological profiles of African security officials, and propaganda materials prepared to claim credit for assassinations that hadn't yet occurred. Most disturbing were the files on individual targets. Each contained personal information that should have been impossible to obtain: family schedules, financial records, educational institutions attended by children, even medical information about elderly relatives. The operation's scope became clear as each country shared its findings. This wasn't random chaos, but systematic warfare. The attackers had studied African societies, identified cultural pressure points, and weaponized the very values that made these societies strong. President Traoré convened an emergency video conference with his counterparts across the region. The faces on the screen represented nations that had often been rivals, countries that had competed for resources and influence. But Guardian Angel had given them a common enemy and a shared vulnerability. Brothers, Traoré began, using a term that transcended diplomatic protocol. We face a threat that recognizes no borders. They have turned our love for family into a weapon against our nations. President Goïta from Mali nodded grimly. Our intelligence services have identified similar pressure campaigns against 3 of our senior officers. We always assumed these were isolated incidents. They studied us, added the representative from Ghana. They learned that African leaders maintain personal relationships with their security teams. They turned that strength into a weakness. Then we turned their strategy against them, Traoré said. If they want to exploit our connections, we make those connections stronger. If they want to isolate our protectors, we ensure no one stands alone. The transformation began immediately. Within weeks, the conference room where betrayal had nearly succeeded became the headquarters for something unprecedented: the Continental Security Coordination Office. The mahogany table where ministers had once reviewed agricultural budgets was replaced with digital command stations linked to 17 African capitals. The walls that had witnessed attempted assassination now displayed real-time threat assessments, family security protocols, and encrypted communication networks spanning the continent. Minister Traoré, whose military experience and crisis instincts had helped save lives during the attack, was appointed as the first director of Continental Security Coordination. His mandate was clear: ensure that no African security official would ever face the choice between protecting their leader and protecting their family. The first order of business was establishing secure housing networks. Universities in stable African countries created protected dormitory systems for the children of security officials. Scholarship programs were established that kept families close to home rather than vulnerable abroad. Medical facilities in major cities created secure wings for treating the relatives of those who served in sensitive positions. But the real innovation was psychological support. Guardian Angel had succeeded by isolating individuals, making them believe they faced impossible choices alone. The new system ensured that every security official had peers to consult, supervisors to report threats to, and support networks that could respond to intimidation. Captain Dio, promoted to colonel and given command of cross-border security operations, implemented training programs that prepared security officials to recognize and resist manipulation. They studied our weaknesses, he told each graduating class. Now we study theirs. The training was comprehensive: how to identify surveillance, how to report threats against family members, how to verify legitimate communications from superiors, and most importantly, how to ask for help without shame or fear of judgment. Within 6 months, the program had identified and neutralized 12 additional Guardian Angel operations across the continent. Security chiefs who might have become unwilling traitors instead became willing informants, providing intelligence that dismantled the entire network. The airplane touched down at Ouagadougou Airport on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 months after her father's death. Aila Sankara walked across the tarmac, accompanied by 2 plainclothes security officers and a social worker from the Ministry of Family Affairs. She was 20 years old now, her face bearing the composure of someone who had aged rapidly through trauma. The bright, eager student who had left for Morocco 2 years earlier had been replaced by a young woman who understood complexity in ways no university course could teach. President Traoré met her personally at the airport, a gesture that raised eyebrows among protocol officers, but sent a clear message about how the nation viewed the families of those caught in the Guardian Angel web. "Miss Sankara," he said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Welcome home." She studied his face for a moment before accepting the handshake. "Mr. President, I'm not sure how to feel about being here." "That's understandable. Your father was in an impossible situation. He chose wrong." Traoré considered this carefully before responding. "He chose love over duty. History will judge whether that was wrong or simply human." During the drive to the capital, Ayla spoke little, watching the familiar landscape of her childhood pass by the window. The country looked the same, but she knew everything had changed. Her father was gone, his legacy complicated by betrayal and tragedy. Her own future was uncertain. "What happens to me now?" she asked finally. "That depends on what you want to happen," Traoré replied. "You could return to Morocco to complete your studies. You could transfer to the University of Ouagadougou. You could take time to grieve and decide later. What would you do?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about it seriously before answering. "I would try to understand why it happened, so I could help prevent it from happening to others." That evening, Ayla visited the memorial wall at the new Continental Security Training Center. Her father's name was etched in black granite alongside others who had been caught in Guardian Angel's web. Usman Sankara, protector, victim, warning. She touched the letters of his name, feeling the cool stone beneath her fingers. Around her, the training center hummed with activity as the evening shift of recruits attended lectures on family security protocols and threat assessment. Colonel Dio, who had known her father well, approached quietly. "He spoke of you often," he said. "He was proud of your studies, your dreams of working for African unity." Did he ever mention the threats? No, and that was his mistake. We've learned that silence in the face of intimidation only makes the intimidation stronger. Ayla turned to the training center, where young men and women were learning to protect without being isolated, to serve without sacrificing their families. "I want to speak to them," she said suddenly. "The recruits?" "Yes, I want them to understand what silence costs." The auditorium was packed with 200 security trainees from 12 African countries. They had come to Ouagadougou as part of the Continental Security Initiative, but none had expected to hear from the daughter of the man whose betrayal had prompted the entire program. Ayla walked to the podium wearing a simple blue dress, the same color as Burkina Faso's flag. She carried no notes, no prepared speech. For a moment, she simply stood before the microphone, looking out at faces that were young, eager, and determined. "My name is Ayla Sankara," she began. "3 months ago, my father tried to kill your president." The auditorium was absolutely silent. He wasn't a traitor. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't ideologically opposed to President Traoré's government. He was a father who was told his daughter would die if he didn't betray his duty. She paused, letting the words settle. "For 3 years, my father protected President Traoré. He stopped a car bomb, rerouted a compromised convoy, and spent sleepless nights ensuring the palace was secure. His loyalty was absolute until the day foreign agents made it impossible." A young trainee from Ghana raised her hand. "How do we prevent what happened to your father?" "You're already doing it," Ayla replied. "You're here, together, learning from each other. My father's mistake wasn't loving me. It was thinking he had to face the threat alone." She gestured toward the instructors seated along the side of the auditorium. "These officers have created systems so that no one faces impossible choices in isolation. They've built networks so that threats against families can be reported and addressed. They've established protocols so that love for family strengthens rather than weakens security." Another hand went up, this time from a trainee from Senegal. "Do you blame your father?" Ayla considered the question carefully. "I blame the people who forced him to choose. I blame a system that made his love for me into a weapon against his country. But I don't blame him for being human." The questions continued for nearly an hour. These young security officers wanted to understand not just the tactics of Guardian Angel, but the psychology of betrayal, the mechanics of manipulation, the human cost of foreign interference. Finally, a young woman from Niger asked the question that hung over everything. "What do you want us to remember about your father?" Ayla took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Remember that he was a good man caught in an evil plan. Remember that 3 years of loyalty doesn't disappear because of 3 minutes of desperation. And remember that the best way to honor his service is to ensure no other father faces his choice." She looked directly at the young woman who had asked the question. "But most importantly, remember that you are not alone. The moment you think you have to face a threat by yourself, the moment you believe you can't trust your colleagues or your superiors with a problem, that's when you become vulnerable to the people who want to destroy what we're building." As she left the podium, the auditorium erupted in applause. But it wasn't celebration, it was recognition. These young officers understood that they were being prepared not just to protect leaders, but to protect each other. In the weeks following the attack, the investigation into Guardian Angel revealed a network of staggering sophistication. Colonel Bationo's intelligence team, working with counterparts across the continent, traced financial flows through a maze of shell companies and front organizations. The money trail led through Luxembourg banks to law firms in London, then to consulting companies in Brussels that claimed to provide risk assessment services to multinational corporations. But the real funding came from defense contractors who profited from instability and mining companies whose extraction deals improved dramatically when governments were weak or compromised. Dr. Miriam Koné, a forensic accountant borrowed from the International Monetary Fund, worked 18-hour days analyzing the financial data. Her findings were presented to President Traoré in a briefing that lasted 3 hours and changed his understanding of modern warfare entirely. "Mr. President," she explained, pointing to a complex chart showing money flows, "this isn't traditional espionage, it's economic warfare using human psychology as the primary weapon." The Guardian Angel operation had cost approximately €50 million over 2 years. For comparison, a single military intervention in the region would cost 10 times that amount and generate massive international opposition. But turning protectors into assassins was cheap, effective, and provided perfect cover for the chaos that followed. They don't want to invade, they want us to destroy ourselves. Every successful Guardian Angel operation creates justification for international intervention, peacekeeping forces, and ultimately favorable resource extraction agreements. President Traoré stood at the window of his office, looking out at the city where his people continued their daily lives, unaware of how close they had come to losing their independence. How many other operations are active right now? Based on our analysis, at least 12, probably more. Then we stopped them all. The African Unity Conference had been scheduled months in advance as a routine diplomatic gathering, but in the wake of Guardian Angel exposure, it became something unprecedented, a Continental Security Summit that would reshape how African nations protected themselves. The venue was the new Continental Security Center in Ouagadougou, built on the grounds of the presidential palace but designed to serve the entire continent. 17 heads of state attended personally, a level of participation that stunned international observers. President Traoré opened the conference with words that would be quoted for decades. "They tried to turn our shields into swords. Instead, we forge a bond no bullet can break." The first day was devoted to intelligence sharing. Each country presented its findings about Guardian Angel operations, creating a comprehensive picture of the threat they faced. The scale was sobering. Over 200 African security officials had been targeted with varying degrees of success. Some had resisted the pressure and reported the threats. Others had been compromised but not yet activated. A few, like Usman Sankara, had been pushed to the breaking point, but the majority had simply disappeared, transferred to other positions, retired early, or found dead in apparent accidents. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana presented the most chilling evidence, a recruitment manual recovered from a safe house in Accra. The document, written in clinical academic language, outlines psychological profiles of the ideal targets for manipulation. They're not looking for corrupt officials or weak men. They're specifically targeting our best people, those with strong family bonds, deep patriotism, and unblemished service records. They turn our virtues against us. The manual detailed recruitment strategies that were sophisticated beyond anything the assembled leaders had imagined. Guardian Angel operatives spent months studying their targets, learning their routines, mapping their relationships, and identifying emotional pressure points. They used legitimate-seeming academic programs to get close to family members, employed fake journalists to gather intelligence, and created artificial crises to test responses. President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, participating via secure video link, offered a perspective shaped by its experience with foreign manipulation during the genocide. They succeed because they make us believe we're facing individual problems rather than collective threats. The moment we start sharing information, their power diminishes. The second day focused on solutions. Working groups representing different aspects of security, intelligence, family protection, financial monitoring, and communication security developed integrated protocols that would be implemented across participating nations. The crown jewel of the new alliance was the African Unity Early Warning System. Using satellite communication networks and encrypted databases, security officials could now report threats against their families in real time to a joint response center staffed around the clock. More importantly, the system was designed to provide immediate support. A security chief in Chad, who received threats against his son studying in France, could alert the system and have protective measures in place within hours. A presidential guard in Senegal, who noticed surveillance of his wife's workplace, could trigger responses that involved multiple countries' resources. 6 months after the attack, the Continental Security Training Center had become the most sought-after posting for security professionals across Africa. The facility, built where the Cabinet Room attack had occurred, served as both a practical training ground and a powerful symbol. The curriculum was revolutionary. Traditional security training focused on physical protection, weapons handling, and threat assessment. The new program added psychological resilience, family security planning, and network-based protection strategies. Colonel Dio, now serving as the center's director of operations, insisted that every trainee understand the human dimension of security work. A guard who doesn't trust his colleagues is a guard who can be isolated and manipulated, he told each incoming class. A security chief who won't report threats against his family is a security chief who will eventually be forced to choose between duty and love. The training scenarios were based on real guardian angel operations, but they went far beyond simple tactical exercises. Each scenario was designed to test not just technical skills, but psychological resilience and decision-making under extreme pressure. The Lagos scenario presented trainees with a situation where their spouse had been kidnapped while visiting family in another country. As the scenario unfolded, trainees received increasingly desperate phone calls from supposed kidnappers demanding classified information in exchange for their loved ones' safety. The exercise tested whether officers would follow protocol and report the threat or attempt to handle it independently. The university crisis scenario involved trainees whose children studying abroad suddenly faced academic expulsion based on fabricated evidence of misconduct. As the scenario progressed, helpful university administrators would offer to resolve the situation in exchange for small favors: access to official schedules, copies of security protocols, or introductions to other officials. The exercise revealed how seemingly innocent requests could escalate into major security breaches. Master Sergeant Fatou Diallo, a veteran of Senegal's Presidential Guard and survivor of her own guardian angel recruitment attempt, developed the most psychologically challenging training module, the isolation exercise. Trainees were presented with escalating threats against fictional family members while being subtly discouraged from seeking help through various bureaucratic and psychological pressures. First, we make them believe the threat is too sensitive to report through normal channels, she explained to visiting instructors from Kenya and Tanzania. Then we introduce time pressure. The family member is in immediate danger and can't wait for official procedures. Finally, we add shame. We make them feel that needing help means they've failed as protectors. The exercise was conducted in a specially designed facility that replicated the psychological environment of isolation and fear. Trainees were separated from their colleagues, given minimal communication access, and presented with increasingly urgent demands, while helpful advisors suggested that involving others would only make the situation worse. The exercise always ends the same way, Diallo continued. The trainees who try to handle the threats alone always fail spectacularly. Their fictional family members are killed, their security positions are compromised, and they face criminal charges for their actions. The ones who immediately reach out to their network, despite all the psychological pressure to remain silent, always find solutions that protect both their duties and their loved ones. The lesson writes itself, but experiencing it changes people at a fundamental level. The center also pioneered the revolutionary Guardian Network concept. Every security official was paired with counterparts from other countries who served as confidential advisors and emergency contacts. These partnerships were carefully matched based on personality, experience, and language capabilities, creating bonds that transcended national boundaries. Colonel Amadou Touré from Mali was paired with Major Sarah Mensah from Ghana. Inspector Jean-Baptiste Nayaji Senga from Burkina Faso worked with Sergeant Khadija al-Rashid from Morocco. The partnerships operated under strict confidentiality protocols. Guardians could discuss threats and seek advice without revealing state secrets or compromising operational security. When my guardian called me about suspicious activity around his daughter's university, Major Mensah explained to a group of visiting officials from the African Union, I was able to coordinate with our embassy in France within hours. What might have become a recruitment crisis was resolved before it could develop into a threat. The Guardian Network had proven its worth repeatedly. In its first year of operation, the system had identified and neutralized 15 Guardian Angel operations across 9 countries. Security officials who might have been forced into betrayal were instead supported through crises, their families protected, and their loyalty preserved. But perhaps more importantly, the network was breaking down the traditional isolation that made security work so psychologically demanding. Officers who had once carried their burdens alone now had confidential colleagues who understood their challenges and could provide both practical advice and emotional support. The psychological impact was measurable. Annual mental health assessments showed dramatic improvements in stress levels, job satisfaction, and family relationships among security officials participating in the Guardian Network. Divorce rates, substance abuse, and early retirement, all occupational hazards of high-stress security work, had decreased significantly among network participants. The success in West Africa didn't go unnoticed by international observers, but it also attracted new forms of attention, some welcome, others troubling. Within a year, similar programs were being established in East Africa, Southern Africa, and North Africa, with the African Union formally adopting the Continental Security Protocols as standard policy across all member states. Dr. Fatima Al-Zahra, a security studies professor at Cairo University, conducted the first comprehensive academic analysis of the Continental Security Initiative's effectiveness. Her research, published in the International Journal of African Studies, documented not just the tactical success of the program, but its broader implications for post-colonial governance. The Guardian Angel operations represented a sophisticated evolution of colonial control mechanisms, she wrote. Rather than using direct military intervention or economic coercion, they weaponized the psychological and cultural characteristics that make African societies strong: extended family networks, personal loyalty relationships, and cross-border educational mobility. Her analysis revealed patterns that intelligence services had missed. Guardian Angel hadn't targeted random officials. They had specifically focused on security personnel from ethnic groups with strong family traditions, from regions where extended family networks were central to social organization, and from cultures that valued personal honor and family protection above institutional loyalty. They didn't just study individual vulnerabilities, Dr. Alzara explained in her conclusions. They conducted anthropological research to identify cultural pressure points that could be exploited systematically across multiple societies. But the African response had been equally sophisticated. Rather than trying to eliminate cultural characteristics that made the continent vulnerable, the Continental Security Initiative had strengthened and systematized them. Extended family networks became early warning systems. Personal loyalty relationships were expanded into professional support networks. Cross-border mobility was secured rather than restricted. The real innovation was cultural rather than technical. African societies had learned to protect their values by sharing them rather than hiding them. In South Africa, the revelations about Guardian Angel operations prompted a comprehensive review of security arrangements dating back to the post-apartheid transition. Intelligence officials discovered evidence of similar manipulation attempts targeting the personal security details of senior government officials, though these had been less successful due to different family structures and educational patterns. The operations were there, explained Brigadier Nomsom Tembu, Director of South African State Security, but they failed because our officials' families weren't as geographically dispersed as those in West Africa. The threats that worked in Burkina Faso and Mali were less effective here. This geographic insight led to one of the Continental Security Initiative's most important innovations, the Regional Vulnerability Assessment Protocol. Each participating country conducted detailed analyses of their specific cultural and geographic risk factors, sharing findings with neighbors to create comprehensive threat profiles. Countries with large diaspora populations developed different protective strategies than those with more concentrated families. Nations with significant numbers of students abroad created different monitoring systems than those with primarily domestic educational opportunities. The approach was Pan-African in scope but regionally specific in implementation. The results were documented in annual Continental Security Reports that became required reading in international relations programs worldwide. Foreign policy experts, development economists, and security professionals from every continent studied the African model as evidence that indigenous solutions to complex problems could be more effective than externally imposed alternatives. Dr. James Morrison, a former CIA analyst turned academic at Georgetown University, wrote extensively about the implications. The Guardian Angel operations failed not because they were technically flawed, but because they fundamentally misunderstood the societies they were targeting. African responses to external threats have always been collective rather than individual. The Continental Security Initiative simply made those collective responses systematic and professional. His analysis was particularly significant because it came from someone with intimate knowledge of how external intelligence services viewed African vulnerabilities. For decades, Western intelligence assumed that African governments were inherently unstable because they were built on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. The Continental Security Initiative proved that personal relationships, when properly supported and systematically organized, could create more stable and effective governance than purely institutional approaches. In Morocco, Ayla Sankara had returned to her studies but with a transformed perspective and enhanced security protection. Her political science thesis had evolved into something far more significant than a typical academic exercise. It became a comprehensive analysis of economic warfare through psychological manipulation in post-colonial Africa that drew on classified guardian angel documents and her own traumatic personal experience. The research process was both academically rigorous and personally healing. Working with her thesis advisor, Dr. Youssef Ben Ali, and a team of researchers from the Mohammed V University's new Center for African Security Studies, Ayla conducted interviews with other guardian angel survivors, analyzed recovered operational documents, and traced the financial networks that had funded the psychological warfare campaigns. My father's story isn't unique. Across Africa, foreign powers have weaponized our greatest cultural strength, our commitment to extended family and cross-border educational opportunity, against our greatest political aspiration, genuine independence and self-determination. The solution isn't to become less caring or more isolated, but to ensure our caring is protected by systematic support networks and our educational ambitions are fulfilled within secure, supportive environments. Her thesis defense, held at Mohammed V University in Rabat, became a significant diplomatic event in itself. The examination committee included not only academic experts, but also intelligence officials, security professionals, and diplomatic representatives from across Africa and Europe. The session was conducted in 3 languages, Arabic, French, and English, to accommodate the diverse audience. Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, a visiting professor from the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, posed the most challenging question. Ms. Sankara, your research suggests that Western intelligence services were either complicit in or willfully ignorant of guardian angel operations. How do you propose that African governments maintain beneficial relationships with these same partners while protecting against their potential manipulation? Ayla's response revealed the depth of her analytical thinking. Professor Hoffman, the question assumes that relationships built on the possibility of manipulation are beneficial. Our research suggests the opposite. True partnership requires mutual respect and transparency. The Continental Security Initiative has shown that when African nations work together openly and systematically, they become better partners for everyone, including Western nations that genuinely seek mutually beneficial relationships. The response was diplomatically sophisticated but academically rigorous, acknowledging complexity while maintaining clear principles. Her thesis passed with highest honors and was immediately translated into Arabic, English, Portuguese, and Swahili for distribution across African academic institutions. More importantly, the research became required reading in security studies programs from Cairo to Cape Town. University students across the continent were learning to recognize psychological manipulation tactics, understand the economic motivations behind political interference, and appreciate the cultural strengths that made African societies both vulnerable to and capable of resisting external exploitation. The guardian angel revelations sent shockwaves through international security communities. The evidence of systematic manipulation of African security officials forced uncomfortable questions about who knew what and when they knew it. European intelligence services found themselves under scrutiny. Some had been unaware of guardian angel operations in their territories. Others had deliberately ignored activities that seemed to target African rather than European interests. A few had been quietly complicit, viewing the operations as useful for maintaining influence in former colonies. The diplomatic fallout was significant. African nations began demanding extradition of guardian angel operatives, freezing assets of suspected front organizations, and questioning intelligence sharing agreements that might have facilitated the operations. But more importantly, the African response became a model for other regions facing similar threats. Latin American countries dealing with foreign manipulation of their security forces sent delegations to study the Continental Security Protocols. Asian nations experiencing similar pressure campaigns adapted the Guardian Network concept for their own contexts. The United Nations Security Council held emergency sessions to address what experts termed weaponized psychology in international relations. While consensus proved elusive due to the involvement of major powers in various manipulation campaigns, the discussions established new international norms around the protection of security officials' families. 2 years after the Cabinet Room attack, President Traoré stood once again in the space where betrayal had nearly succeeded. But the room was unrecognizable. Gone were the traditional trappings of executive power. In their place was a state-of-the-art command center connecting African security forces across the continent. The memorial to Usman Sankara remained, but it had been joined by others, men and women who had been caught in Guardian Angel's web, some who had resisted successfully, others who had not. Each name represented a lesson learned, a vulnerability addressed, a protection strengthened. Minister Traoré, now serving as Director of Continental Security, presented the annual threat assessment to the assembled leadership. The statistics were encouraging. Attempted manipulation of security officials was down 73% across participating countries. Successful operations had dropped to near zero. Guardian Angel taught us something valuable, Traoré concluded. They showed us that our greatest strength, the personal bonds between leaders and protectors, could become our greatest weakness if we allowed those bonds to exist in isolation. But when we connected those individual relationships into a continental network, they became unbreakable. The success had come at a cost. The new security protocols were expensive, requiring significant resources from countries that could barely afford basic services. The psychological screening and family protection programs demanded constant vigilance and coordination. Trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild. But the results spoke for themselves. Across Africa, governments were more stable, security officials more confident, and families more protected. The continent was learning to defend itself, not through isolating its leaders, but by ensuring they were never truly alone. The third graduation ceremony at the Continental Security Training Center was different from the previous ones. Among the graduates were second-generation participants, children of security officials who had chosen to follow their parents into service, but with a deeper understanding of the challenges they would face. Isla Sankara, now 22 and holder of a master's degree in international security studies, was among them. Her decision to join the Continental Security Service had surprised some, but seemed inevitable to those who knew her story. President Traoré delivered the graduation address, speaking to 300 new officers who would be deployed across the continent. His words carried the weight of experience and hope. You are not just guards or investigators or analysts. You are guardians of an idea, the idea that African nations can protect themselves through cooperation rather than competition, through trust rather than isolation, through shared strength rather than individual vulnerability. He paused, looking out at the young faces before him. 3 years ago, foreign forces tried to teach us that love makes us weak, that caring for our families makes us vulnerable, that trust makes us foolish. Today, you graduate as proof that they were wrong. The ceremony concluded with the reading of the Continental Security Oath, words that had been crafted collectively by the participating nations. I swear to protect not just the leader I serve, but the principles we share. I pledge to report threats without shame, to seek help without fear, and to remember that my strength comes not from standing alone, but from standing together. I vow to guard against not only external enemies, but internal isolation, not only physical threats, but psychological manipulation. I serve my nation by serving our continent, and I serve our continent by protecting the bonds that make us strong." As the new officers recited these words, Ayla thought of her father. He had died believing he faced an impossible choice alone. These young men and women would never face such isolation. The true test of the Continental Security Network came not from a dramatic attack, but from a quiet phone call on a Tuesday evening in Lagos. Inspector Adebayo Ogundimu of the Nigerian Presidential Guard received what seemed like a routine wrong number at his home. "Sorry, I think I have the wrong number," a woman's voice said. "I was trying to reach someone about my daughter's university application in Canada." The call lasted only 30 seconds, but something about it troubled Ogundimu. The woman had mentioned his daughter's name, the university she actually planning to attend, and specific details about her application process. A wrong number shouldn't have contained such accurate information. Under the old system, Ogundimu might have dismissed the call as coincidence or handled the concern privately. But the Continental Security Protocols had trained him to trust his instincts and report anomalies immediately. Within an hour of his report, the Continental Early Warning System had identified similar wrong number calls to security officials in 3 other countries. The pattern was clear. A new Guardian Angel operation was beginning. The response was swift and coordinated. Canadian authorities were alerted to provide protection for the students mentioned in the calls. Intelligence services in Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon began investigating the communication patterns. Financial monitoring systems tracked the phone accounts and payment methods associated with the operation. Most importantly, the targeted security officials were immediately provided with protective support rather than being left to face the threat alone. Their families were secured, their communications monitored, and their psychological well-being supported by trained counselors. The operation collapsed within a week. The Guardian Angel operatives, accustomed to isolating and manipulating individual targets, found themselves facing a coordinated continental response. Their psychological pressure campaigns failed because their targets had immediate support. Their surveillance operations were detected because multiple intelligence services were watching. Their escape routes were blocked because neighboring countries had been alerted. 8 operatives were arrested across 4 countries. More importantly, 17 security officials who might have been forced into betrayal were instead strengthened in their resolve and supported in their service. Inspector Adebayo Ogundimu, whose instincts and trust in the system had triggered the successful response, was invited to speak at the next Continental Security Conference. His message was simple. The system works because we made it work. Every threat reported makes us all stronger. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah III, an economist at the University of Ghana, published a groundbreaking study on the economic impact of the Continental Security Initiative 18 months after its implementation. His findings surprised even the program's strongest supporters. Traditional security spending focuses on equipment, training, and personnel. The Continental Security Initiative represents a new model, investment in systemic resilience rather than individual protection. The numbers were compelling. Countries participating in the initiative had seen their security costs decrease by an average of 23%, while their stability indices improved across every measurable category. The reduction came from shared resources, coordinated training, and the prevention of crises rather than just responding to them. More significantly, economic confidence had improved dramatically. Foreign direct investment from legitimate sources had increased by 40% in participating countries, while extractive industries found themselves facing better organized governments that negotiated more favorable terms for their citizens. The Guardian Angel operations failed in their immediate objectives, Dr. Nkrumah concluded, but they inadvertently triggered the most successful collective security initiative in modern African history. The research caught the attention of development economists worldwide. The African model of network-based security was being studied and adapted by other developing regions facing similar threats. Despite the systemic success, the human cost of Guardian Angel remained. Families had been torn apart, trust had been broken, and some wounds healed slowly or not at all. Minister Traoré, who had been held hostage during Usman's final desperate moments, struggled with anxiety for months after the attack. The man who had once joked easily about escaped goats and rural administration now found himself checking locks repeatedly, avoiding crowded spaces, and starting at unexpected sounds. His recovery became part of the Continental Security Initiative's broader mission. Recognizing that trauma affected not just direct victims, but entire government structures, the program developed comprehensive psychological support services for officials who had experienced attacks or threats. Dr. Amina Traoré, no relation to the president, a psychiatrist from Senegal, established the first continental post-trauma support network for government officials. Her clinics in Dakar, Ouagadougou, and Accra provided specialized treatment for public servants dealing with the psychological aftermath of political violence. "We learned that protecting leaders means protecting everyone around them," she explained to a conference of African mental health professionals. When a minister develops anxiety after an attack, it affects his decision-making. When a security official suffers from hypervigilance, it impacts his judgment. Trauma is contagious, but so is healing. Minister Traoré became one of her most prominent advocates, speaking openly about his therapy sessions and encouraging other officials to seek help when needed. "Strength isn't pretending we're unaffected by violence," he said. "Strength is getting the help we need to continue serving effectively." The success of the Continental Security Initiative had implications far beyond Africa. Intelligence agencies in Washington, London, and Paris found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their awareness of Guardian Angel operations and their responsibility for preventing such campaigns. Some defense contractors faced investigations and sanctions for their roles in funding destabilization operations. Law firms that had facilitated money laundering for Guardian Angel found their African clients withdrawing billions in business. Consulting companies that had provided cover for intelligence operations faced congressional hearings and public scandals. But more significantly, the African model challenged fundamental assumptions about how developing nations could protect themselves. The traditional approach, relying on external security guarantees and bilateral defense agreements, was being replaced by indigenous, collaborative solutions that proved more effective and less expensive. European Union officials, initially skeptical of the Continental Security Initiative, found themselves requesting briefings on its methods. The refugee crisis that many had predicted would follow political instability in West Africa had never materialized. Instead, the region had become more stable, more prosperous, and more resistant to external manipulation. Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna of France, speaking at a closed session of EU defense ministers, acknowledged the new reality. "We can no longer assume that African security challenges require European solutions. In fact, the evidence suggests that African solutions might be more effective for African challenges." The admission marked a fundamental shift in how major powers viewed African independence and capability. As Ayla Sankara's graduation from the Continental Security Service approached, she faced a choice that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. She had been offered positions with international organizations, academic institutions, and even foreign intelligence agencies interested in her unique insights into Guardian Angel operations. But she also had an offer from President Traoré himself, to serve as special advisor on family security, helping to expand the Continental Security Initiative to include proactive protection for the relatives of security officials. The decision wasn't difficult, but it required her to confront the legacy of her father's actions directly. She spent a long evening at his memorial, reading the letters that visitors continued to leave there. Many were from security officials, thanking him for the lessons his tragedy had taught them. Others were from family members expressing gratitude for the protections his sacrifice had made possible. The letter that moved her most came from a young security officer in Mali, whose sister had been targeted for recruitment by guardian angel successors. "Your father's story saved my sister's life. Because of what happened to him, I knew to report the threats immediately. The system protected us both. His death made our protection possible." Standing before the memorial, Ayla made her choice. She would serve, but not to honor her father's memory, to complete what his life had started and his death had made necessary. The next morning, she accepted President Traoré's offer. Under Ayla's leadership, the family protection protocols became increasingly sophisticated. Drawing on her academic research and personal experience, she developed comprehensive programs that addressed not just physical security, but educational opportunity, career development, and psychological support. The breakthrough came when she realized that Guardian Angel had succeeded by offering African families things they couldn't get at home: quality education, economic opportunity, and social advancement. The solution wasn't to prevent families from seeking these opportunities, but to create them within Africa itself. Working with education ministers across the continent, Ayla helped establish the Continental Academic Network, a system of universities and scholarship programs that allowed African students to receive world-class education while remaining within secure, supportive environments. The program partnered with international institutions to bring professors and resources to Africa rather than sending students away vulnerable. Harvard Business School established a satellite campus in Accra. The Sorbonne opened a science center in Dakar. Oxford University created a political science program in Nairobi. "They used our dreams against us," Ayla explained to a gathering of African education ministers. "They offered our children opportunities abroad, then held those opportunities hostage. We're responding by bringing the opportunities home." The results exceeded all expectations. Within 2 years, the Continental Academic Network was educating the children of security officials, government ministers, and civil society leaders in programs that rivaled the best universities in Europe and North America. More importantly, these students were building connections across Africa that would serve continental unity for decades. 5 years after the Cabinet Room attack, the transformation was visible everywhere. The Continental Security Initiative had evolved into something much larger, a comprehensive system of African cooperation that encompassed security, education, economic development, and cultural exchange. The success had attracted global attention. Development experts studied the African model of collaborative governance. Security professionals from other continents attended training programs in Ouagadougou. Academic institutions worldwide sent researchers to understand how trust had been rebuilt after systematic betrayal. President Traoré, now serving his second term, often reflected on the paradox of progress born from trauma. The attack that was meant to destroy his government had instead catalyzed the most successful period of African cooperation in modern history. "They tried to teach us that trust was dangerous," he said during a speech marking the 5th anniversary of the Continental Security Initiative. "Instead, they taught us how to make trust systematic, sustainable, and unbreakable." The statistics supported his optimism. Participating countries had experienced their longest period of political stability in decades. Economic growth averaged 6% annually across the network. Military coups, once common in the region, had virtually disappeared among member nations. Most importantly, the psychological warfare tactics that had nearly succeeded against Usman Sankara were now failing consistently. Security officials understood how to recognize manipulation attempts. Families knew how to report threats. Support systems responded immediately to emerging crises. Guardian Angel and its successor operations had been reduced to what intelligence analysts called nuisance-level activity, expensive for the perpetrators, ineffective in their goals, and increasingly risky as African security services became more capable of identifying and prosecuting foreign operatives. The 5th anniversary of the attack was marked by the dedication of a new memorial at the Continental Security Center. Unlike traditional monuments to military victory, this memorial honored resilience, recovery, and transformation. The centerpiece was a bronze sculpture showing hands reaching toward each other across a map of Africa. Below it, engraved in Arabic, French, English, and Portuguese, were the words, "Strength through unity, protection through partnership, peace through understanding." The dedication ceremony was attended by thousands, security officials, government ministers, family members, and citizens from across the continent. But the most moving moment came when Ayla Sankara, now Director of Family Security Services, read the names of all those who had been caught in Guardian Angel operations. Some had resisted and survived. Others had been broken by impossible choices. A few had become heroes through their sacrifice. All were remembered not as individual tragedies, but as a collective struggle that had ultimately made the continent stronger. "We gather not to celebrate victory over enemies," Ayla said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd, "but to honor the truth that no one should face impossible choices alone. My father died believing he had to choose between his duty and his love. Today, thousands of security officials across Africa know they never have to make that choice because they never have to make it alone." As the ceremony concluded, representatives from each participating nation placed soil from their homelands in a garden surrounding the memorial. The symbolic gesture represented something that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier: African nations willingly sharing their sovereignty to protect their collective independence. As the sun set over Ouagadougou that evening, President Traoré stood in his office looking out at a city that had grown more vibrant and confident in the years since the attack. The markets were busier, the universities fuller, the streets safer. But more than that, there was a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. The Continental Security Initiative had become the foundation for other collaborative programs. The Continental Academic Network was producing a generation of leaders educated in African institutions but connected to global knowledge. The Continental Economic Coordination Office was helping member nations negotiate better deals with foreign investors and resist economic manipulation. Most importantly, the success had proven something that many had doubted. African solutions to African problems were not only possible, but more effective than external interventions. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ayla entered, carrying a folder marked with the seal of the Continental Security Service. "Mr. President, the monthly threat assessment. Anything concerning?" 3 attempted recruitment operations, all detected early and neutralized. 2 family protection interventions, both successful. 1 new member application from Tanzania. Tanzania? That's excellent news. Ayula smiled. They're particularly interested in the family education protocols. Apparently, they've identified some concerning patterns in their own security services. As she prepared to leave, Traoré called her back. Ayila, do you ever wonder what your father would think of all this? She considered the question seriously, as she had learned to consider all difficult questions. I think he would be proud that his death had meaning. He always believed in African unity. He just didn't live to see it become possible. Do you think he would approve of your choice to join the service? He would understand it, she replied. He taught me that protection is not about eliminating all risks, but about ensuring that when risks emerge, you don't face them alone. I'm here to make sure no other security official ever feels as isolated as he did. After she left, President Traoré remained at his window as darkness fell over the capital. Lights began to twinkle across the city, in homes where families gathered for evening meals, in universities where the next generation studied for exams, in offices where civil servants worked late to serve their fellow citizens. But now there were other lights visible too, the communication links connecting Ouagadougou to security centers across the continent, the data flows sharing threat intelligence and protective protocols, the network connections that made isolation impossible and betrayal ineffective. The Guardian Angel operation had failed in every way that mattered. It had not destroyed African leadership, but had strengthened it. It had not created chaos, but had catalyzed cooperation. It had not proven that love made societies weak, but had demonstrated that love, properly supported and systematically protected, made societies unbreakable. The conference room attack in Ouagadougou ended in minutes, but its consequences would shape Africa for generations. What began as a story of betrayal became a testament to resilience. What started as individual tragedy evolved into collective triumph. The Continental Security Initiative continued to expand, eventually including 43 African nations and serving as a model for similar programs on other continents. The psychological warfare tactics that seemed so sophisticated and unstoppable proved vulnerable to the simple power of transparency, mutual support, and systematic cooperation. The Guardian Angel's failure marked the end of an era when African nations could be easily manipulated through the isolation of their leaders. In its place emerged a new model of African strength, not the individual heroism of isolated leaders, but the collective resilience of connected societies. The memorial to Usman Sankara remained at the center of the Continental Security Training Center, but it was no longer a monument to tragedy. It had become a reminder of transformation, proof that even the deepest betrayals could become the foundation for unshakable trust. And in the end, perhaps that was the most powerful victory of all, the demonstration that love, rather than being a weakness to exploit, was the greatest strength any society could possess, as long as that love was shared, supported, and systematically protected. The lights over Africa burned brighter than ever, connected by bonds that no external force could break. The continent was no longer rising alone. It was rising together.